Thank you everybody for joining us this evening, and tonight's featured speaker will be Glynnie Walford. Glynnie has been with the Martin Collins Group for 25 years and has extensive knowledge across the sports horse and thoroughbred racing worlds, having been actively involved in both. She was Managing Director or CEO of the British-based company before relocating to the USA in the fall of 2010 to promote the company and its products in the USA. Glynnie has coached the British Dressage Regional Advisors on footing, has spoken at the Aachen School of Course Design in Germany, and presented to students at equine colleges. Glynnie is a rider and was a dressage competitor and a work rider for thoroughbred trainers in the UK. She now has a keen interest in the cutting world and has quarter horses. Welcome, Glynnie, and over to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and good evening, everybody. I hope you're going to find this evening informative and helpful, and we're going to be talking about common mistakes when building and maintaining an outdoor arena. So we'll move on to the first topic, which is construction. When we're considering building outdoors, it's always really useful to take into consideration the seasons. So, for instance, you wouldn't really want to be considering constructing when the weather is particularly bad in midwinter and wet, because obviously the machinery that's going to be coming in will require the ground to be stable, and I think that's probably the best way of putting it. So it's better if you can plan it that you do it in the spring or the summer or the fall. Choosing a location, this is always another very important point, and some things to point out here that you can take into consideration when you're thinking about building. Are you going to be close to a tree belt? If you are, you're going to have to consider that you're probably going to have leaf fall in the autumn, so you'll want to be able to remove those, because otherwise if they're left, they're going to rot and then they could contaminate your surface. Take into account too how far you are from the barn. If you're away from the barn, then you probably want to put an approach track in, so that it keeps the horse's hooves and the wheels of the machinery clean before it gets onto your all-important surface. Think about services, utilities. This could be a hazard, so see if you can get some plans so you know where your utilities are and to avoid those. Think also about other obstacles. So you might have water troughs, you might have other buildings, you might have had a situation where other buildings were on that particular site at some point in time. So there might be something under the ground that you're not altogether aware of. And then the final thing really is selecting a contractor. I think this is a very, very, very important point. I think that it's such a huge outlay that it's well worthwhile seeking a contractor where they can actually provide you with referrals. So you want to take them up on that, and if you can find something local to you, go and look at the work that they've done. Talk to the people that they've worked for, because obviously without the contractor around, they're going to tell you how they found them to work with, how professional they were, did they clean up after themselves, were they keeping them abreast of what was happening during the construction period. So I think do your homework. That's most important. So if we move on now, let's talk about other considerations. Touched a little bit on this, positioning. Shelter. I think it's better if you can try if at all possible, to construct your arena where you're in a sheltered position. So you haven't, you're not on the top of a hill and you've got the wind blowing through you on a cold and blustery day, for instance. We've also talked about utilities, and that's a very important point to take into consideration. We've talked about the trees, and again, talking about trees, think about if that's the only place where you can put it and you're willing to lift the leaf fall, think about the tree roots, because obviously they're going to extend quite a way in, perhaps to where you're going to build your arena. So I think that should be taken into consideration also. Access to the arena, touched on that, having an approach track. And this will just save an awful lot of headaches if you can put an approach track in, if your barn is somewhere from where your arena is going to be located. Other obstructions we've touched on, they may be hidden, they may be visible, they may be overhead. So I think sitting down and writing yourself a checklist would be a good way to go. Another important point to consider, which is kind of covered on positioning, is where to put the arena in terms of how your land lies. Just remember one key thing: the more level the land, the less expensive it's going to be when you actually start that construction, because you're going to have less fill to move. Last thing to consider is how to improve a current footing without starting a project from scratch. It may well be that if you remove the current footing that you have, and say for instance you were on an old-fashioned sealed base and you wanted to turn that into a free vertical draining base, you might be able to use what you've got as what we call a formation layer. So rather than starting right from scratch again, you could use that as a formation layer and start to build to the ground on top of that, because that's essentially what we're trying to build out of the ground. You build into the ground, you're likely to create a swimming pool. So it could well be that that base can be used. So I would definitely explore that avenue. Moving on, now we're going to cover types of soil, and this is just skimming the top of it, because obviously this is a vast country and it varies greatly, not only from state to state, but almost from county to county. I've learned since moving here. So the basic ones that we tend to find are, say, sand. So for instance, Florida, a lot of people are on straight sand. Then you'll have your sandy loamy mix, and then you'll have your clay mix. You'll find that things will probably be a lot easier in terms of cost if you're building on a sandy loamy type of soil or a sand sub-base. Certainly, once you come into, say, rock or clay, then you start entering into other areas where care has to be taken in terms of the type of base that is built. So moving on from the soil, we'll now talk about building and the cut and fill. And a cut and fill basically is where you're taking out from a high spot and filling in the lower spot so that you're actually creating a level formation layer on which to build your arena. So as it says on the slide here, it says cut and fill is the process of cutting into a bank and relaying that material lower down the bank to create a level formation. And again, this brings me back to saying that wherever you are on your property, if you can find an area where the land is flatter, you've got less than a cut and fill to take into consideration. The banks and the slopes must be created correctly to support the new formation. So say, for instance, you've got quite a big cut and fill, then your contractor will only take a certain amount of that soil, relay it on the lower side, then he'll compact it. then you'll take a little bit more and a little bit more, so that you end up with a stable subbase. So that over compacting is important, so that you know that as that cut and fill is being put into place, what you're going to put on top of the cut and fill is not going to collapse. And then the rule of thumb, as we've said a couple of times now, the more level the site, the less expensive on that initial cut. Now, moving on from your cut and fill, we then come on to the topic. Oh, here we go. This is exactly what I was talking about. I'm sorry, I'd forgotten that this good shot is here. This was a huge project, and that bank, just for your interest, was actually a 20-foot cut. So there was a lot of it. So you can see here where you've got that grassy bank now, because this arena now has been in for a little while, so everything has settled. We've got nice covering on that bank, which would have been soil to begin with. And you've got your area that comes down. And we'll talk about this in greater detail, but this is a very good shot to explain your exterior perimeter drain, which you can see clearly on the grey there around the arena. And we tend to put an exterior drain in, and you do not allow anything to grow over the top of that. And this extends outside your fencing there. This is actually a shot from an arena in England. And you'll see that there they tend to use a lot of timber. It's treated timber, but a lot of 3-rail fencing with the support board underneath. And then if you move across there, you'll see, not too clearly, but it'll give you an idea that you then have what we call a batter on the far side. So that's the slope away from the arena where the actual formation layer was created. So you can see that we've built out of the ground, and we're working on a level vertical drainage. So now we're going to talk about drainage. And we work on something that's called a vertical drainage system. And I'll explain that in greater detail. But just to say, this is where your contractor is going to prove worth his weight in salt, because he will know your type of subsoil that you're dealing with, because it varies from area to area on the sort of substrate you're going to be dealing with. So we've also talked about sand and sand or loamy soil, clay. You might have to deal with some rock. You might have slopes that you've got to deal with before it actually gets to where your arena is going to be, you know, if you're going to be doing a big cut and fill. You'll want to be talking about drain specifications, the type of backfill, and a layout. So I'm going to give you just a broad overview of what we consider a free draining base to be. And as I say, it will vary, and this is where your contractor is going to come into play. But we work on a series of drains according to the type of subsoil that we're dealing with. So the more free draining the subsoil, the less amount of drain runs you're going to require. The heavier type of subsoil, clay, the more intensive the drainage system has to be. Because as we know, with clay or heavy clay, that land is not going, it has no porosity, so the water is not going to drain through your subsoil. So we have to make a provision for that. So let's take an easy one, and we'll go on to a slightly more difficult one. If you've got a sand or sandy loamy type soil, we'll probably put in drains across the arena at every 30 feet, and those will link up to an exterior drain with a T-pipe, and then those outfalls will drain at the lowest point of the arena. And the way the drain run is going to operate depends on where your long side and your short side is going to be. So for instance, if your fall was longitudinal or lengthways, then you're probably going to run drains that way, connecting to outfalls at the short side, draining away. So that's a longitudinal drainage system. If your fall is from side to side or from end to end, you're probably going to want to put in lateral drains that run across the arena, and they again will attach into an exterior drain which will, at the lowest point, which will take surface water away. If you have now, those outfalls either will drain out onto the land, or sometimes they are drained into what we call soakaways, and a soakaway will take the water away. If, however, you're on clay or heavy clay, that is not going to work because it's not going to soak away. So you would probably intensify your number of drains, dependent too on how big your arena is going to be. But normally we put them every 30 feet. And then those outfalls will pipe away from the arena, because there's no point putting a soakaway in because they're not going to soak away. Cut-off drains. If you are going to be having to build your arena on a slope, so you've, similar to that photograph that you saw, and you know that there's going to be quite a lot of surface water skimming across the top of the land before it gets to your arena, you can put what we call a cut-off drain in before it gets to the arena, so it buffers that amount of water coming down the hill. And that cut-off drain can be as big or as small as the land dictates. So if you're going to have a huge rush coming down, you'll probably want to put a pretty beefy, a pretty hefty cut-off drain in there, which can be a French drain, or it can be a complete soakaway itself. So you're either going to cut the drain, put a pipe in, probably a good 6-inch perforated pipe, backfill that, and that could be one type of cut-off drain. Or you might just put a straight soakaway in, which means that you cut that trench and you fill the whole trench with a clean stone, and that acts as a cut-off drain. Now, the width and depth of the drain specifications, again, is dependent upon the type of subsoil or substrata that you're dealing with. Rule of thumb is probably a 1 foot by 1 foot trench dug out with a 4-inch perforated pipe. The cut-off drain, as I've just said, is going to want to be a bigger pipe than that, probably a 6-inch. And again, if you're on a heavy type of soil, you might want to put an exterior perimeter 6-inch perforated pipe in. So therefore, your drainage trench is going to be that much bigger to cope with that bigger pipe. The backfill has to be clean. So the backfill is what we call the stone that actually fills up the drainage trench. So you want a backfill that is absolutely clean, drainage gravel. So there are no what we call fines or dust in it, because if there are little tiny fines or dust, they are going to wash and they could render that perforated pipe impervious over a period of time. So the backfill must be absolutely clean. And as I've said, we tend to put an exterior perimeter drain in. Sometimes it's not possible to do that. You have to put an interior perimeter. Sometimes the land is a good draining land, so you don't need that exterior perimeter. But again, this is where your contractor is going to come into play big time. And he should also talk through that drainage layout with you. Most important point. So moving on from drainage, we're now going to talk about stone. And the type of stone that's used. This is, again, one of those topics that varies from area to area. And the stone here very often goes by a numeric name, where it doesn't in say, the UK. So I think you should always be aware of the type of materials that are required for your construction and your build and what you're being supplied with. So again, we go back to your contractor. In building a free draining base, after your drains have been installed, we lay a separator membrane, what we call a separator membrane. It's a thin membrane and it comes in rolls, and we roll it out and overlap it by 6 inches, and then this stone layer goes over the membrane. Now in some instances you're not going to need that separator membrane, but the main reason for this thin membrane is to keep the clean stone clean and to stop any of the earth moving up and into the stone, or vice versa. So the stone drainage blanket, as we call it, is your base layer. And as I said, it varies from area to area, and it varies by its number. But one point that goes no matter where you are is it should be clean stone, and it should be angular. And by clean, again, similar to the drainage gravel, we mean that there are no fines, no little stones in there going down to dust. Because over a period of time, and it might take a year, it might take 2 years, or however long, but you do, if it's not clean, then you do run the risk that those fines or dust are going to render that base impervious. And again, it should be an angular stone, so that when it's rolled after being laid, it rolls in, and because it's subangular, it interknits. And so when you look at it, it should look as smooth as a pool table. The depth of the type of stone, again, will vary on your substrata. So for instance, if you're on very, very heavy clay, this is the worst type of scenario, and that's the only place you've got to build, you might be on an area where the clay is so heavy it has soft spots, in which case those soft spots should be dug out and stabilized, and you can do that with some packed stone. It doesn't have to be the super stone that goes on the top. But if it's a good substrata, then you can put a lesser depth of stone, whereas if you're on a very heavy clay base, you might want to be putting 6, 8 inches of stone, whereas if you're on good substrata, the minimum that we recommend is really about 4 inches. Again, the type of stone we've talked about, you really need a stone that, if you're in the colder climates, has got a resistance to frost penetration. You don't want to put a soft stone down where when the frost hits, it starts to crack, and then when the winter has passed, it could, I'm not saying it will, but it could then knit itself together. And when it does that on a soft stone, again, it's rendering that base impervious. You want a good, angular, hard stone. And the shape of it, as I've said, is a subangular, and the size of the stone is probably about a 2-inch, sometimes even a little bit bigger than that. On some tracks that we've built, you know, you could have a stone that's a lot bigger, but because it's, again, subangular, when it's rolled, it will interknit. But again, your contractor should go through all this with you and explain what type of stone is available to you and the depth, and be advising you on those particular points. So moving on now to talk about the next topic. So in talking about the type of fencing that we're going to use, the specification is something that you need to work out that's really relevant for your discipline and what materials are available in your area. Because I've now come to see that here it varies greatly. You can go from anything from, say, a dressage fencing, what we call a dressage fencing, which is basically your 2 retaining boards that retain your surface within your arena, that are fixed onto posts, and those posts are concreted in, and the timber is treated, to what I call it a hip height fencing. And I've seen this a lot with hunter jumpers, and I must say it looks very attractive. And that comes to hip height, and it has what I call a little feathered cap edging on the top of it. You can then see the old traditional style of 3-rail or 4-rail fencing, again timber, which is treated. And that's something to bear in mind as well when you think about the resilience to the type of weather that you're going to be coping with in each individual area. And then again, now these days, there is the plastic fencing that is supposed to be maintenance free and very easy to erect, and it's becoming more popular. So there are a lot of choices there. So I would definitely, again, do your homework, go and look at as many as you can and decide what's right for you and what's right for your discipline, and also take safety into consideration. Because I think if you're working with a lot of young horses, it's prudent to maybe put something with a higher rail there. And in talking about fencing, I'm just going to touch on what goes over the stone layer and underneath the surface. Because in the old days, people were very, very worried by membranes. And certainly I can remember riding and you'd see the membrane popping up through the middle of the surface, or you'd see it coming away at the edges of the retaining boards. Well, those days have changed big time. And there are membranes available now and methods by which they're fitted or laid onto the arena, which should alleviate those fears if done correctly. There's a very thick membrane that's available now and extremely strong, and it goes over your stone base, and it comes in rolls. And the rolls are laid, overlapped by 6 inches, and heat flame welded with a blowtorch, not to melt them, but just to get those 2 edges to stick together. So that stops the membrane from curling and working its way up and into your riding surface. And then to further secure it, it can be pulled to those retaining boards and lipped up and either fixed with a roofing battening or a nail gun. So that stops it from shrinking back and working its way up at the edges. But what I would definitely say is that things have changed in terms of the way people are thinking about sealed bases these days, where one was really reliant upon a crossfall, a fall of the land to take surface water away, or a crown where the water drained off the crown and away. Those really are not terribly easy to deal with, as we know, because you'll get a deluge of rain and you could have to be coping with surface migration or footing migration, where the water just whooshes down and takes the surface with it from end to end or side to side, however the fall is constructed. And the same can happen with a crown. So if you're starting from scratch, I would just seriously think about the cost implications and about ease, because certainly it's easier to maintain a level footing than it is to maintain one with a fall or one with a crown. So just little things to be aware of there. Moving on now from fencing, let's talk about what's ideal. Well, turf. Turf really was the traditional surface for all equestrian sports. And it is, when it's good, it's the best. However, it is difficult to maintain, as we all know, in perfect condition. Can get too dry, can get too wet, but under ideal conditions, there's no doubt about it that turf is the blueprint for synthetic surfaces. Turf is, as we've just said, is affected greatly by climatic conditions, where your synthetic surface should be able to take you through most of those instances. So moving on, we'll now talk about what are the requirements of a synthetic riding surface. Well, very simply, it should be safe and sympathetic on which to train and compete. So it should give cushion, it should give some energy return back up through the limb and the musculoskeletal system of the horse, and be much kinder to the horse. Should be consistent. If it's installed correctly on a good base, it should be consistent in its way of going. So it should be consistent end to end, side to side. it should have good climatic tolerance. Now, the weather patterns, well, what can I say? We're all coping with pretty bizarre weather patterns at the moment, and we'll come on to talk about it in a little while, but certainly as far as maintenance goes, we're adapting to what Mother Nature is throwing at us. Patterns aren't so stable as they used to be, so we're learning too that we have to alter our maintenance procedures to cope with what Mother Nature throws at us. But in essence, a synthetic riding surface should be much more climate tolerant. And the last point is that they should be easier to maintain. And there are things that you can do to help yourself in making that happen, but overall they should be far easier to maintain. So moving on from the requirements, let's talk about maintenance. This is a very, very forgotten about topic, I feel, and one that really needs to be brought much more to the forefront. Proper maintenance of a synthetic surface or your surface is absolutely crucial. Absolutely crucial. Even if you put a synthetic surface in and it's absolutely terrific and you say, well, it doesn't move and I've got good hoof prints showing and there's good energy and it's just great, I don't have to do anything to it. No. A surface is a living thing. So you do have to maintain it. And really, it should be over-maintained in the first 6 months of its life, 3 to 6 months of its life, and then you can alter that on an as and when and the number of horses and the type of work that it's receiving. But really, it doesn't take that long to do. And in its initial stages of its life, it should be groomed every day. And then, if you're in a barn where you've got a lot of horses, or there's a lot of horse traffic coming in, or you're just very active, it still should be groomed every day. Doesn't take that long to do, and it will help your surface enormously. The types of grooming equipment, there are a lot of them on the market. I would just make sure that you find the right one to suit your type of surface. If you've got a coated surface, then you really want something that's not, well, in all of them, you do not want something that's going to drag it. Those were the days when we had just straight sand, and you dragged the sand and with your bar and your leveler. Now they're much more sophisticated. So what you really want to be able to do now is to groom it and keep it level, not, in inverted commas, drag it. So I would be very careful about the type of piece of equipment that you choose. Most of them go on to a 3-point linkage on the back of a tractor. So make sure that the machine that you are going to buy can be pulled and lifted by your tractor. That's a very important point, that your tractor is actually gutsy enough to be able to lift it. There are others that can be just attached to a ball hitch, and if you haven't got a tractor, there are alternatives. Maintenance of, let's talk about quickly maintenance of coated surfaces, because we've got dry ones here, but let's talk about coated ones. If it's a good coated surface, then those don't require or should not require an irrigation system. They are easier to maintain in that the coating coats the components of that footing to hold it together, in essence. So the maintenance of those should be easier. But again, across the board, lifting of horse manure droppings is really important, because if those are left and allowed to dry out, then they're going to contaminate the surface, and in the case of a coated footing, they are going to dry out that coating. There's no doubt about it. So very important point to bear in mind on a coated surface. They do require what I call aeration. I think that's probably better way of describing it. And we're finding this now. This is one of the things I was saying we're learning as well with what Mother Nature's throwing at us. The coated surfaces, when you're maintaining them in the winter time, for instance, we always advise our clients to put the tines down on the machine a little bit more in the winter. And you want more roller in the summer, less tine, and in the winter you want more tine, less roller. So when you know that cold wet weather's going to start to hit, you really want to put your tines in a little bit deeper so that you stop or alleviate over compaction taking place. Because if you don't pay attention to it and the surface becomes over compacted, you will need to aerate it, and it is not the job of an arena groomer to aerate a surface when it's become over compacted. You need to get your contractor in, and he's going to need to open the surface up, open it up, get those components with getting some air into them so it gets that cushion back in it again. He'll then open it and resettle it to get it back to the going that is going to get it to ride to its optimum performance level, and then just keep an eye on it. We always advise, again across the board, that you take surface depths. Not difficult to do and will really help you. If you can even have a screwdriver that's taped up however many inches of the depth of your surface. Draw yourself a little rectangle, or whatever shape your arena is, and then, for instance, on a rectangle, go down the track, up the quarter line, down the center line, up the 3/4 line, and take some random depth checks in off that track, maybe, I don't know, 5 meters in. Record, push your screwdriver down, compact the area that you're going to do, so stamp on it, push your screwdriver down, not so you go through your base, but just so you hit your base, and record that depth on your piece of paper. And if you do about maybe every 15 feet, maybe, and then record them on your chart. And in looking at those, it's going to tell you immediately if your surface is starting to go what I call out of whack, out of level. Because what you don't want to do is not do that and get to a situation where you've got 2 inches of footing in one place and 7 inches of footing somewhere else, because that's going to mean that you're going to need to get your contractor in to regrade and level the surface before you can proceed again. So that's important, because you start getting down to what I call those dangerous levels, like 2 inches and below, the horses are going to be hitting the base, and that is not good. So that little exercise to do, probably every 4 months, is really important. And then also, see if you can follow a maintenance pattern. So for instance, on our website, on the UK website, we have a leaflet which has lots of little arrows, and it shows you how you can maintain your surface to go either longitudinally or in circles, and how you should alternate those. That way, you're doing everything you can to try and keep that surface level and stop it from going out of whack. Moving on to the moisture level for dry surfaces, yes, a dry surface. So that's sand, it could be sand, sand and rubber, sand and fiber, a sand mix. You always want to keep those moist. They have to be moist so that whatever is within the sand is kept within the sand. Because if they're allowed to dry out, then they're going to actually end up being cuppy. You'll get dips, you'll get divots. If it's got fibre in it, the fibre's going to come to the top of the footing. I mean, you can always rototiller it back in again, but you don't want to allow that happen. You get inconsistencies in the going if a surface has been allowed to dry out, or your watering system isn't consistent throughout your ring, so you're getting more moisture in one part of your ring than another. So in other words, the horses are trotting along on a nice surface that got the right amount of moisture, and then you've got a dry area, and it suddenly becomes cuppy, and they go, ooh, because obviously you're putting their footing out, because the consistency is out within the footing itself, if that makes sense. So the moisture level for a dry surface is really important. They do need moisture, they do need watering, and there are lots of different ways to do it. There are the good old-fashioned sorry, I've just put the name of it has gone completely out of my head. How stupid. You know, the tanker that you're pulling on the back of the tractor. Sorry about that. So you've got that way of doing it with a spray bar. You've got the sophisticated big water cannons that are located in corners, and also maybe in some of those big rings they have 3 or 4 down the sides. You've got the overhead sprinkler systems, you've got the pop-up systems. I mean, there's lots out there on the market. So again, I would go and do your homework on the type of footing that you're going to put in, and look at an installation that has that footing and how they water it if it's a dry surface. And again, a little point to touch on here, that's quite true. If they're watered, some of the surfaces, some of the ones that I've seen, have actually become very, very firm when the weather has had a play in this. So you can get all sorts of inconsistencies. So I would just be very, very careful and do your homework and go with what works for you, because you also have to take into consideration if it's outdoors, one little point here, and you're on the top of a hill, and you're watering and the wind is blowing and you've got sprinklers, then the wind is going to take the water. So the time that you water is also very important. So water when it's late at night, or as late as possible, or if it's nice and calm first thing in the morning. Just little pointers that help you. And then the drag versus groomer. Well, I think we've covered that really on the early days when they were just sand, and you really needed something that had a bar and was just going to drag it and move it around. So now I think it's a lot more sophisticated. Certainly, surfaces have changed so much over the last 20 years. It's quite incredible. And then I think now moving on, you can see a photograph. This is a photograph of a machine that we have. It's called an Arena Master. And you'll see that it's got a roller in the front and a roller at the back to aid in keeping the surface level. It's got an adjustable tine on the front, a rather large S tine, and that has a reversible tip. So when that tip starts to wear, it's on a bolt, you just flip it over, and then you've got a new section then to work. And then it's got rows of adjustable slanting tines, straight tines. So that's the machine that we tend to use for our footings. But as I say, there are a lot out there. Martin Collins surfaces, our footings. The ones that are available in the USA are cloth fibre, which is a polypropylene fibre that is quite different because you actually have to rototill this into sand. And when we start to talk about this, a lot of people are very worried when they hear that it's got to be rototilled into a compacted 4 inches of sand, and they think that's going to be very deep. Well, the fibre actually is spread over the compacted 4 inches of sand, and touching on it very quickly, the sand is well compacted and watered, the fibre is spread evenly and well watered, rolled, and then it's very slowly rototilled into the top 3 inches of sand. And the idea behind this is that the fibre within the sand particles, a bit like if you look at the root structure under grass. So in teasing out, it's helping to form a matrix and a cushion on top of the inch of sand that you don't disturb. And that fiber then helps to create stability within the sand. It gives energy back up through the musculoskeletal system. And it's also a fiber that has a good moisture retention. I found in the installations in, say, California, that their watering has actually been cut down by half, which is very good news when water is such a valuable commodity. Readily available, and although it isn't rocket science to install it, and we do have a DVD that shows you how you can install it, there are a few key points that really need to be followed. And the amount of fiber that goes into the sand, you're probably wondering, really depends on the type of discipline and how many horses are using it. And it's our responsibility to help you arrive at the right amount of fiber that's going to go into your ring. The other footing that's offered here is our coated product, which is MC EcoTrack. This is a coated product in a robust wax coating, and it is one that has been supplied to professional, private barns, veterinary establishments. It has been on the market for a long time, mainly in the UK and Europe. And now is here in the US and also in, well, other countries now, worldwide really. And it's suitable for, again, with cloth, the fiber, both of them are suitable for indoor or outdoor use. The coating on it means that you don't have to irrigate it. It is easier to maintain. I have touched on the maintenance if it's indoors, or outdoors in actual fact during, this variance of winter weather that we're experiencing. But it is a very robust coating, and again, all disciplines. However, I will say that in both of these, there is no what we call slidability. They are designed to support the horse. So what we're looking for is to give the horse confidence and support, whether it be a show jumper taking off from a fence, or landing from a fence, a dressage horse, a baby horse that's learning to extend, collect, an older horse that's doing its movements, etc. So they're designed to support the horse in whatever it's doing. It does provide shear, and the shear factor means that when the hoof actually lands, it has that little bit of forward movement allowed to it, which is what you must have. You can't have a situation where the hoof is going to land and then the surface stops that little bit of forward movement, which we call the shear factor. So both of them are designed to give shear, but those are the two products that are available in the USA. And we also like you to go along and look at them in an installation and to talk to the people who are using them and who are maintaining them, so that you can really evaluate the surface and us for yourselves. I think we have a couple of pictures actually. Yes, this is hoof imprint. This actually is our clot fiber and sand. And ideally, this is what we're locally maintained. We're looking for the hoof imprint and the little bit of shear that you can see without it being deep. So the horses, with the correct maintenance, work more off the top of the surface rather than through it. So moving on, I think now we should be seeing a little slide that says what sets Martin Collins surfaces apart. Longevity. The oldest coated product that we have in the US actually will be 10 years old this year. It's an outdoor footing and it will require recoating this year, but it's been very well maintained. The droppings have been collected, and it's not in a warm climate, it's in a cold climate, and it has been looked after well, but it's 10 years old this year. The surfaces are tested too before they're put on the market. So both the cloth and sand and the MC EcoTrack have been on the market for in excess of, 17 years now. Martin Collins as a company has been the longest in the business. I think Martin installed his first surface, got to be over 40 years ago now. We do have a proven track record. We'd like to pride ourselves on the fact that the footings that we produce and that he is always looking to produce, because he's always looking for the next surface to invent, are more sympathetic to the limbs of the horse. We want something that ours are easier to maintain, and also that you're going to get customer care. You're going to get follow-up. We're not going to sell you something and then leave you high and dry, and that we like to think of with the contractors that we work with too. So moving on from this one, I think we should now see just a couple of photos. This actually is in the UK, and that, golly, that was taken a while ago, I have to say. There's 15,000 square meters there of MC Eco Track, and this is where the European Championships were held. And that's actually Nick Skelton jumping there. And that's actually in the Queen's back garden. That's Windsor Castle, you can see in the background. And she does actually always attend the Royal, well, it's called the Royal Windsor Horse Show, and she does attend. And you can see the flags right at the top of the flagpole, which means she's at home. And then moving on from there, completely different shot. And this is in the Middle East. And this surface has been down, oh golly, probably about 9 years now. 9 years. Very, very, very different type of installation. We do have a footing guide that's available, and everyone who's registered for the webinar this evening, you will receive a copy of the 25-page footing guide via email. Hopefully is packed with some useful information for you on arena material selection and the construction aspects, and a good piece of educational literature to have in your hand. We're also running an ambassador program. We're seeking facilities to act as our ambassador representative in selected areas of the US. And we'd love you, please, to visit the Martin Collins USA website for details of it and how to submit an application. And this will be running till, I believe it's the end of March. The selected facilities will be eligible for an attractive discount on the footing, but we do want to stress that it's not free footing. I wish we could, but we're not in a position to be able to do that. But it's an exciting program that we're running, and it's, well, we've just had a huge response, and it's been wonderful because we've spoken to some terrific people. I'd like to thank you so very much for participating in this, and please don't hesitate to contact us if you require any further assistance, or you just want to talk through what you're doing at home, or whatever really, maintenance, the footing that you have installed already. And you can see that my email is there, and also the website, and also that number there is my cell number.